Good evening, and welcome to tonight's U.S. Senate Republican candidate debate from the Johnny Carson Theater here in Norfolk, Nebraska, sponsored by the Norfolk Daily News, Norfolk High School, along with KETV in Omaha and WJG Radio in Norfolk. My name is Kent Warnicki, and as editor of the Daily News, I'm pleased to have all of you with us tonight. We appreciate your coming out for this debate. Before we proceed any further, allow me to introduce the four individuals who are the reason why we're here tonight. Starting on my immediate right, Pat Flynn. Don Stenberg. Deb Fisher. And John Bruning. To the candidates, I would say that I will serve as your moderator tonight, which I should point out is different than being a mediator. We are interested in spirited debate, but we'll keep it in reason. And along those same lines, let me encourage the audience to refrain from applause or verbal outbursts during a candidate's response. Politeness and civility should be the order of the day, and I'm assuming that this should not be a big problem because, after all, many of you are Republicans. We begin with questions from our panel of media representatives, and let me introduce them to you. To my immediate left is Jerry Genther, regional editor of the Norfolk Daily News. To his left is Rob McCartney, news anchor with KETV in Omaha. And finally, Jim Curry, news director of WJG Radio in Norfolk. Thank you, gentlemen, for helping us with the debate tonight. The media representatives will ask a question to the candidates, all of which will have no more than 1 minute to respond. The order in which they speak will be made clear with each question, and they will be alerted when their time is up. And with that, we're ready to begin. The first question will be from Jerry Genther, and it will go first to Mr. Bruning, followed by Mrs. Fisher, then Mr. Stenberg, and then Mr. Flynn.
Why do you believe you are the Republicans' best bet to defeat Bob Kerrey?
Question, and thank you very much to the Daily News and KETV and WJG for hosting this debate. It's nice to be back in Norfolk. It's nice to be among friends. I look out here and I see Sheriff Yorth, who's a good friend of mine and has endorsed me, as has Speaker Mike Flood from this area. The county attorney Joe Smith and 79 other sheriffs and police chiefs, 40 county attorneys across this state have endorsed my candidacy. In sum, I think what you'll find is in 10 years as Attorney General, those people that have watched me most closely know that I can get the job done. Right now, we have very difficult times in America. We have $15 trillion in national debt. We have a president of the United States who's proposed 4 consecutive budgets with trillion-dollar deficits. It's going to take bold leadership. We're going to have to make changes. We're going to have to cut spending. Nebraskans know that I'm the guy to do it. I've done it as Attorney General. I know how to work with my peers and my colleagues, and we've been effective, and I promise you we can do it in the Senate as well.
Thank you, Mr. Bruning. Mrs. Fisher.
Thank you all for being here this evening, and I'd like to thank the sponsors for this event. I appreciate your interest in this very important election. I believe that I've shown that I'm not your usual politician. I'm not a career politician, but I have been effective in my 8 years in the legislature. I've taken on tough issues, I've worked with my colleagues, and we've gotten those major policy issues passed in the legislature. That's what the U.S. Senate is. It's a legislative body. Also, I think I offer a very stark contrast to Bob Kerrey. First of all, I'm from Nebraska. Secondly, Bob Kerrey has a record as I do. Mine is a strong conservative record. Bob Kerrey votes for tax increases. I vote to give you tax relief. Bob Kerrey votes for partial birth abortion. I am opposed to partial birth abortion. Bob Kerrey supports cap and trade. I am opposed to cap and trade. I work with my colleagues, I take on tough issues, and we get them passed, and we do it in Nebraska, and I'd take that to Washington.
Thank you, Mrs. Fisher. Mr. Stenberg.
I'm running for the United States Senate because I believe our country is going in the wrong direction. And I believe that in order to get our country going in the right direction, we need to send a genuine, lifelong conservative to Washington to represent Nebraska. Now, when all the candidates have very similar positions on most issues, the question is how do you tell who the genuine conservative really is? And I believe you do that by looking at the candidates' records. Now, that's a difficult thing for an individual to do, to have the time to do that. But there are organizations that have done that. U.S. Senator Jim DeMint and his Senate Conservatives Fund. Freedom Works, a nationwide Tea Party organization with many members here in Nebraska. And Club for Growth. And all of those organizations want smaller government, lower taxes, less government regulation. And they have examined the records of all of the candidates, and they have all endorsed me and are working for my election. And I would invite you to join their members here in Nebraska in supporting Don Stenberg for the United States Senate. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Stenberg. Mr. Flynn.
I believe the majority of America is more conservative than not. Unfortunately, we just keep moving further and further to the left, whether Democrats or Republicans are in power. And why is this? We are not electing leaders anymore. We're electing career politicians. Career politicians are incapable of leading this country into the future because they lack the experience in business and do not know what it's like to have their back up against the wall daily. Actually, I'm the only businessman in the race. I started my business at age 23. I knocked on doors for 11 years, day in and day out. I was a high school volunteer youth minister for 13 years. I worked 20 to 30 hours a week in that. For 13 years, we became the #1 youth group in the state. What I've learned from these experiences is this: if we lead with truth, people follow.
Thank you, Mr. Flynn. Time now for a question from Rob McCartney. His question will be directed first to Mrs. Fisher, followed by Mr. Flynn, and Mr. Bruning, and then Mr. Stenberg.
Do you support a federal stand your ground law? And if you felt threatened, could you pull the trigger?
I'm a strong supporter of the Second Amendment, and I've shown that in the Nebraska legislature. I was a co-sponsor of concealed carry. I introduced and passed the hunter mentoring bill. Those are two bills, I believe the only two, dealing with our Second Amendment rights that have passed during my time there. I support a castle doctrine law. When it comes to the stand your ground, we had one in the legislature this year. It involved not only your homes, being able to protect your home and your family, but also in your vehicle, and I would support that. Could I pull the trigger if I was defending my family? Yes.
Thank you, Mrs. Fisher. Mr. Flynn.
Yes, I do support that law. And the thing is as far as I'm concerned, the gun laws in this country are just, there's a full-blown assault to the Second Amendment and the gun laws. And we ought to be able to protect ourselves anyway. I don't agree with having to register all these guns and everything else with the federal registry. And so I'm really against that. But I do support I do support that law. And really, I would pull the trigger, and it's getting to the case anymore where more and more of us are going to have to be willing to pull the trigger, because really there's a full-blown assault on life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness in America today. And I'm saying we need warrior citizens, and we better get it right in our attitude, because they are coming at us from all directions.
Thank you, Mr. Flynn. Mr. Bruning, your response.
I do support stand your ground. And I've been supported by the National Rifle Association in every election that I've run in. I have an A rating from the National Rifle Association. I'm proud of it. You come to my campaign office, you'll see my life endowment membership statue they sent me. I send my own money to them. And I'm a strong supporter of the Second Amendment, and I'm a hunter. I like to chase pheasants. I like to chase chukars, and I like to chase quail. And I enjoy hunting, and I'm always going to be a supporter of the Second Amendment. And I would pull the trigger, and I've actually had to confront that in my personal life, not pull the trigger, but think about it, because I was stalked as Attorney General, had a guy coming to my house on a regular basis, and I had to confront that thought, whether or not I'd pull the trigger if he came back to protect my family, and I would.
Thank you, Mr. Bruning. Mr. Stenberg, your response.
Yes, I would support a federal stand your ground law, and I am a strong supporter of the Second Amendment. The National Rifle Association has rated me A or A+ in every election I've been rated in, including this one. Could I pull the trigger? Yeah, if I needed to do that to defend my wife or my kids or my grandkids, I certainly could. I've had some experience in that. When I was the Attorney General, we had several executions that came to conclusion during that period of time. It was a difficult thing, but the right thing to do for justice. And in that regard, as a Second Amendment defender, I would have voted against Eric Holder as Attorney General of the United States. He had a clear anti-gun record going into that nomination, as well as a number of other questionable activities, including his involvement in the pardon of Mark Rich under the Clinton administration. So had I been a United States Senator, I would have voted no on Eric Holder as Attorney General of the United States.
Thank you, Mr. Stenberg. It's now time for a question from Jim Curry. It will be directed first to Mr. Stenberg, followed by Mr. Bruning, Mr. Flynn, and then Mrs. Fisher.
If the U.S. Supreme Court comes back and rules the health care law or parts of it unconstitutional, what would you propose instead to replace it?
Well, I hope that they do rule it unconstitutional. It seems to me it's a tremendous stretch of federal power for the first time ever to require a citizen to buy a product that they may not want to purchase, and I hope the court will so rule. It's hard to answer that question in 60 seconds. I would say that we need to rely on market forces. I would allow insurance companies to sell across state lines so that we would get more competition in the insurance market. I would support tort reform so that doctors don't have to ask for a lot of tests and do a lot of tests that really aren't necessary that they have to do to protect themselves, and so that so much medical money is not going to pay lawyers. Beyond that, I think that we need to use market forces. We need to encourage citizens with a system that encourages them to shop for the best medical care and use their medical care wisely.
Thank you, Mr. Stenberg. Mr. Bruning.
Well, I hope and pray that the Supreme Court will strike down Obamacare. I was in the courtroom 2 weeks ago for every minute of those arguments, and I watched as those justices struggled with a question that I think should be answered in the affirmative, and that is, has Congress crossed the line when it passed Obamacare, when it passed what the founders intended for the Commerce Clause and tried to force individuals to purchase health care? I think that particular mandate is unconstitutional. I think it's beyond what the founders intended for the Commerce Clause, and I hope that it indeed is struck down. That's a lawsuit I led as president of the National Association of Attorneys General. We were 13 at that time. We were mocked roundly. I was in the courtroom with a whole lot of Harvard professors who were pretty smug when we filed it, and they said we wouldn't be successful. And thus far, we have been successful, and I'm hoping we will be. And I got to tell you, it felt pretty good seeing those guys in the courtroom. And realizing we're on the cusp of overturning that law. Don Stenberg's exactly right in this regard. We need tort reform, we need to sell insurance across state lines, and we need market forces.
Thank you, Mr. Bruning. Mr. Flynn, your turn.
I've been in the health insurance industry since age 23, and I've seen this coming for a long, long time. Now, when the Republicans had all the power in the world, they had the presidency, the Senate, and the House, I was just duly amazed. We could see this coming on for a long time, this issue. And all they said is, we're against government-run health care. And I thought, oh, what a solution that was. And so I'm really saying we got to start leading with solutions as conservative Republicans. And that's what Pat Flynn's all about. Number one is prevention. We have to give doctors the opportunity to widen their scope of practice. Really, the pharmaceutical lobbyists are controlling the medical doctors and every other doctor when it comes down to it and making them just work within the scope of practice. So we have to get to alternative forms of medicine. Number two is we have to get rid of these mandates. And number three, we got to have tort reform and then let competition reign. And it will get cheaper than ever because everyone's after that health insurance dollar, which is 20% of every dollar spent in the United States.
Thank you, Mr. Flynn. Now is time for a question from one of our students from Norfolk High School that is participating. Oh, I'm sorry. Mr. Flynn, thank you. Mrs. Fisher.
Thank you very much. I think the question needs to be, does the federal government need to replace Obamacare? We need to have the discussion and the debate on how to get affordable, accessible health care. Does that need to happen at the federal level? That's the problem we have with Obamacare. I agree that we need to have tort reform. We need to look at carrying insurance across state lines. We need to also look at making it easier for healthcare associations to form. And we need to shift the discussion from a fee-based service to a value-based service. We have to look at finance, we have to look at delivery, and we have to look at outcomes with health insurance. As I travel the state of Nebraska and visit with insurance agents and visit with healthcare providers and hospital administrators and with people who can't get insurance, they want to have a discussion, they want to have a debate on what is truly needed here in this country.
Thank you, Mrs. Fisher. Now comes a question from one of our students at Norfolk High School. Victoria Clafter is a student in the Advanced Placement Government class taught by Kathy Steinkamp. Her question will go first to Mr. Flynn, followed by Mr. Stenberg, then Mrs. Fisher, finally Mr. Bruning. Victoria.
What economic policies right now do you think need to be changed in order for my generation to have the same economic opportunities as the generation before me?
Well, I see that there's really four things that need to be addressed. The Federal Reserve needs to be addressed. Debt in this country has gone off the charts, and really, Benjamin Franklin said that one of the main reasons for the revolution was the Central Bank of England. And that's what created, they just can't print money. You just can't print money. So unless we talk about the money situation, debt doesn't matter. Next, we have to address the debt. I'm for, and we can't increase the debt anymore. The third thing is addressing the debt, and that's I'm for cutting spending 35% right now. That's the budget deficit. That's what we got to do. Our money supply, our monetary system it's on the cusp of failure. And so we have to do that. And the last thing is we have to address our tax system, which I'm for the fair tax.
Thank you, Mr. Flynn. Mr. Stenberg.
Right. I think there's a number of things we need to do. I'd identify four slightly different than Mr. Flynn. One, we need to balance the federal budget. The Congress of the United States is leaving a very unfair burden for our young people with almost $16 trillion of debt, and that's increasing. And I support a balanced budget amendment to the Constitution of the United States to deal with that issue. We need to roll back the heavy burden of federal regulations. It's making it harder for employers of all sizes to create jobs, and I have a plan on how to roll that back, and I hope we'll talk about that later. We need to repeal Obamacare. That's going to be another heavy financial burden on the next generation. It's going to ruin health care in the United States over time. And finally, we need to develop our domestic energy resources so that we're not sending hundreds of billions of dollars to the Middle East and other places unfriendly to our country. We need to create those jobs here to reduce the cost of gasoline and diesel fuel, which means families will have more money available for the other needs of their families.
Thank you, Mr. Stenberg. Mrs. Fisher, your response.
Thank you. Thank you for the great question, and I appreciate your interest as a young person in this. It is very important for you because we have to turn the economy around, and I believe we need to do it by cutting spending, by balancing the budget, and addressing that over $15 trillion debt that we face. And it's not going to happen overnight, and you should never believe a politician who looks at you and says, oh, send me to Washington, because I'm going to do this and this and this and this. Because the shape we're in as a country, it's going to take time. But we can do it. We can do it. We can do it by reforming our tax code. We can do it by reducing regulations, by reducing energy costs, by repealing Obamacare. We can do it by letting small businesses be the job creators that they are. Small businesses are the economic engine here in Nebraska, and they are in this country too. So in order for you to get a job, and I hope remain here in Nebraska, we need to let those businesses create the jobs without a lot of government interference.
Thank you, Mrs. Fisher. Mr. Bruning.
How do we get the economy back on track? You have to start by balancing the budget. We do it here in Nebraska. We have a balanced budget amendment to our Constitution, and it works. And what you have is a legislature led by Speaker Flood from right here in Norfolk that when times get tough, Nebraskans tighten their belt. We don't spend more money. We don't raise taxes. We cut the budget to make ends meet. And we can do that at the federal level. We have to do that. Repealing Obamacare, we talk about it, but think about what it costs. President Obama said it would cost $900 billion. The reality is it's going to cost $1.7 trillion. That's the nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office. We need to repeal all these regulations. I filed more than 20 lawsuits against EPA as Attorney General. Been Attorney General now in my 10th year, 20 lawsuits. So you don't have to take my word for it that I'm going to challenge the federal government. I've done it. In 10 years, I keep filing lawsuits, and it feels like I'm throwing rocks at a tank, and I need to get inside the tank and strip the gears out and try to stop this monstrosity that's the federal machine. But we can do it with those steps.
Thank you, Mr. Bruning. Our next question comes from Jerry Genther. It will go first to Mr. Bruning, followed by Mrs. Fisher, then Mr. Stenberg, finally Mr. Flynn.
Probably throw a little change up here. I'd like each of you to name a strength or something you admire in each of your opponents tonight.
Absolutely. I'm happy to do that. Let me start with Senator Fisher. She's on my left. She has been a tenacious and very successful state senator. She's had a very successful career in her 8 years. She's known as somebody that gets it done, and I admire that. Don Stenberg is a family man that I admire greatly. His wife, Sue, is a wonderful person. His kids are great kids. He's a great family man, and I admire that about him. And Pat Flynn never gives up. He has a passion and energy that I admire, and he's just plain likable. I always enjoy seeing Pat Flynn.
Thank you, Mr. Bruning. Mrs. Fisher, your response, please.
Thank you. Well, I admire and thank Mr. Bruning and Mr. Stenberg for their service to this state and their willingness to step forward in this campaign as well in order to serve the people of this state. I admire Mr. Flynn for offering to serve the state of Nebraska and the people of Nebraska and also stepping forward in this race.
Thank you, Mrs. Fisher. Mr. Stenberg.
Well, I admire Pat Flynn because he very clearly speaks his mind, and that's sometimes rare in politics. I admire Senator Fisher because I've gotten to know her during the campaign, and she's just a very nice person. And I admire John Bruning because he's a great political fundraiser, and I hope to follow in those footsteps.
Thank you, Mr. Stenberg. Mr. Flynn.
Well, I admire Mr. Bruning because he does have quite a good outlook on life, and he's always very positive. And Mrs. Fisher, she's tenacious in her walk, and she has a family, and that says a lot. And Mr. Stenberg, he just keeps going through thick and thin and moving on, and so those are good qualities.
Thank you, Mr. Flynn. Now time for a question from Rob McCartney. It will be directed first to Mrs. Fisher, followed by Mr. Flynn, then Mr. Bruning, and then Mr. Stenberg. Rob.
Draw the line for us. What should be private and what should be public for an elected official?
Could you restate the beginning? I didn't hear the first.
Just draw the line for us.
Oh.
How far where do people go between private and public if you're an elected official?
It's difficult to put yourself out there and to put your family out there. So I would draw the line at family. You know, I have the support of my husband and our 3 grown sons. That's very important when you embark upon a mission like this. That's very important. But they don't answer the questions. They don't vote. In the legislature, my record is obviously available for anyone to look at and anyone to ask a question about. But when it comes to family, that's where I draw the line.
Thank you, Mrs. Fisher. Mr. Flynn.
Well, I just figured there was no line the way it's been going in America lately, actually. So I really haven't thought about that question too much. But you know what? I want to be a public official. If they want to delve into my life, that's fine. I've had my ups and downs, and you know, it's made me the man of character I am, to be real frank with you. And you know, by the grace of God, I was able to walk through it. So, you know, in some ways, as far as I'm concerned, America, Nebraska can know about my life because it will give people hope that no matter what kind of shape we're in our life right now, we can get through it with God and other family and our country.
Thank you, Mr. Flynn. Mr. Bruning.
Well, I think you understand when you get into this business that it's going to be a public life that you'll lead. I mean, for me, I'm trying to reduce our debt and our deficit in this country, and I'm very comfortable living a public life. I can tell you when I was in Washington for the Obamacare arguments, American Bridge and the Democratic Party had trackers that were waiting for me outside my hotel in the morning and followed me in at night. And that's fine. I don't mind that. In fact, Joe is probably here tonight. He's a nice young guy, and when he would come to my fundraisers, we'd feed him. He's a fine young kid. I mean, he said he was roofing houses before he was following me, and that this paid better. So we treat him well. I mean, that's, I understand the public life we lead, and I'm very comfortable with that. My goal is to reduce the debt and deficit and make this country better than the way I found it.
Thank you, Mr. Bruning. Mr. Stenberg.
Well, I agree that family should be off limits. I think any statement that you make as a public official, I think any action that you take or any letter that you write as a public official is part of the record that the voters have a right to examine. And so if you write a letter supporting Eric Holder to be Attorney General of the United States, I think that's a fair campaign issue. I think if you compare welfare recipients to bug-eating raccoons, I think that's a legitimate issue to talk about for the candidate that raised that issue. I think if you call for the resignation of the then Catholic Bishop of Omaha and say he's unworthy of his position while you stand on the floor of the legislature, I think that's a legitimate issue because it goes to the character and judgment of the candidates. So I think anything you've done as a public official is a fair subject for consideration when you're running for the United States Senate.
Thank you, Mr. Stenberg. Time now for a question from Jim Curry. It will be directed first to Mr. Stenberg, followed by Mr. Bruning, then Mr. Flynn, and then Mrs. Fisher.
This regards sanctions against Iran. The president agreed recently to new sanctions to slow that country's oil exportation, targeting financial institutions that purchase that country's oil in relation to that country's nuclear potential. With oil prices and tensions rising, how do you think this action will play out, and is that move enough?
Well, I certainly support that. Iran is led by a man who repeatedly calls for the total and complete destruction of Israel. He has a very negative attitude toward the United States and has provided weapons to persons who are fighting the United States forces in the Middle East. We need to use the strongest possible sanctions. And looking down the road, we need to develop our domestic energy resources so we're not always dragged into the Middle East and there are long-term problems that have been going on for so long. I've been very disappointed in President Obama's treatment of Israel. I think he's been disrespectful to their president, and I think he has given the enemies of Israel, and particularly Iran, reason to think the United States might not be supportive of Israel if a crisis came. And I think that's the wrong message for the President of the United States to send.
Thank you, Mr. Stenberg. Mr. Bruning.
Well, I appreciate the question. I am an unabashed supporter of Israel. I've been to Israel 4 times. I've taken my daughter. I've taken my father. I believe Israel is our closest ally anywhere on the globe, and I believe we need to stand with Israel. Radical extremist powers like Iran cannot be allowed to become nuclear, and they're close. As we speak, their centrifuges are spinning up weapons-grade uranium. They have 150 kilograms, give or take, of 20% enriched uranium. They have many tons of 3% enriched uranium. They're doing it at the Fordo site that's, hundreds of feet under granite in Iran. And we need to prevent them from becoming nuclear, because if they behave the way they do today, imagine how they would behave if they had nuclear weapons. They threaten to wipe Israel off the map. That is not acceptable. And if we need to use force, we have to be prepared to stand with Israel to use force. I hope it doesn't come to that.
Thank you, Mr. Bruning. Mr. Flynn, your response.
Well, I tend to think of, I'd rather follow Ronald Reagan's prescription, to be real frank with you. Going after sanctions is a reactive type of thing. I'm for leadership, which means we need to produce and become independent on our own energy needs. Really, we get the price of oil to $50 a barrel, and Iran's, basically neutralized when it gets to the money. Money's the big thing, and so I'm also really on our energy independence, I'm for repealing the Commodities Futures Modernization Act, which takes energy and commodities from a speculative back to a market force. And so really, I would support some of those, but, I want to get aggressive with what we need to do as a country, and maybe we should decide on our own what we think is good for us rather than worrying about everyone else. Our independence is most important.
Thank you, Mr. Flynn. Mrs. Fisher.
Iran is a threat to Israel, which is the only democracy in that region and a close friend and ally of the United States. Iran is a threat to that region of the world, and Iran is a threat to the entire world. I'm happy to see that we are pursuing stronger sanctions. I'm encouraged to see that countries in Europe are stepping up and imposing sanctions. And I would certainly support this administration if they would pursue stronger action against Iran at this point. It's dangerous for the world if Iran is able to achieve nuclear capability, and I don't believe that we should allow that to happen.
Thank you, Mrs. Fisher. Now comes time for another question from a student at Norfolk High School. Morgan Whipperling will have a question that will be directed first to Mr. Flynn, followed by Mr. Stenberg, and Mrs. Fisher, and finally Mr. Bruning. Morgan.
While I see the need for a stop to illegal immigration, do you believe that we should have policies making immigration shorter? That way we can allow more people to come into our country that want to contribute to our economy.
That's a good question. Actually, I'm not for increasing the amount of immigrants that come to our country. We have 1 million a year right now, and some people would attest that we need 250,000. And when you look at the unemployment rate and the welfare system in this country, that's really what I think we need to go out after. We need to go. The fact of it is my duty is to help protect and represent Nebraska, be an American. So Americans are first, and what I'm really saying is we need to give a lifetime maximum aggregate of 6 months for unemployment. And then on welfare, we need to go after a 75% reduction. There's a lot of generations and cultures that have never worked in America, and we need to force them. The only way we're going to have them learn how to work is go with the policy, if you don't work, you don't eat. And that's where we're at the precipice in America today. So I'd rather focus on Americans and get them to working.
Thank you, Mr. Flynn. Mr. Stenberg.
Immigration, of course, is a multifaceted issue, and first and foremost, we need to secure our borders so that we don't have more illegal immigrants coming into our country. And to do that, I support building a double-walled fence across the border and increasing our border agents so that we can stop that. I'm also not in favor of amnesty. But once we have our immigration system under control, once we've controlled our borders, we do need to reform our system so that we're letting the right people into this country legally. In particular, people who can make significant contributions to our country. Inventors, scientists, doctors, other entrepreneurs. Make sure that we don't have criminals coming into our country. Make sure that we don't have illegal drugs flooding across our borders. But in the end, we first need to secure our borders, and then we can improve our immigration system so that we're getting the right immigrants here.
Thank you, Mr. Stenberg. Mrs. Fisher.
The number one responsibility of the federal government is national security. It's to protect this country and to protect the citizens of this country. So I believe we have to secure our borders. We don't know who's coming into this country. We don't know what they're bringing with them. That is an issue for all of us. We need to have a plan in place. We need to have a federal government who will enforce the laws. That's necessary. I would also support an e-verify system for employers. I do not believe we should be offering incentives to illegals who are in this country, such as the in-state tuition, which I voted against in the Nebraska legislature. I don't believe that we should encourage people to come here illegally. We need to encourage them to come through legal methods. And I would not support offering a path to citizenship for anyone who has come to this country illegally.
Thank you, Mrs. Fisher. Mr. Bruning.
Well, let me start by saying we're all a nation of immigrants. My great-great-grandfather came here July 20th, 1861. My great-great-grandmother, I got pictures of them above the fireplace that I know my wife thinks is a little strange, but I like them because it reminds me It's not cruel to ask people to follow the law. I don't think it's cruel to tell people they have to abide by the law. And so, my actions as far as my time as Attorney General, Governor Heinemann and I introduced and pressed a bill that stopped non-emergency benefits for illegal immigrants. We got that passed. I worked with Senator Jansen on an Arizona-style bill here in Nebraska, and in fact signed on to an amicus brief supporting the state of Arizona. And I got Sheriff Joe Arpaio's endorsement. You probably know about Sheriff Joe. He's very tough on illegal immigration. We have to figure out how to shore up the border. We haven't yet secured the border, and it amazes me the greatest country in the world can't do that. We need to get that done.
Thank you, Mr. Bruning. The next question will be from Jerry Genther, and it will go first to Mr. Bruning, followed by Mrs. Fisher, then Mr. Stenberg, and Mr. Flynn.
When solving a problem, do you generally follow a familiar approach or seek a new one?
Well, that's the first time I've gotten that question, Jerry. I appreciate it. We've had a lot of problems to solve in 10 years since I've been Attorney General, and 6 years before that as a state senator. I mean, one of the problems that all of us are dealing with at any level of government is how to reduce the size and scope of government. One of the things we did, as in my time as Attorney General, we didn't have a Medicaid fraud unit. We created one when I became Attorney General. It was a little bit of a risk. I went out on a limb to do it. It ended up costing the taxpayers about $1.2 million over the last 5 years, which is a significant investment. But it's returned $45 million. $45 million in 8 years in a $1.2 million investment. So how do we go about that? I talk to the smartest people I can find, get their opinions, but in the end, I got to make the best decision I can for the taxpayers. You got to look inside and make the best decision you can to come to the right answer. And I think generally we have. I think Nebraskans should be proud of the office we've run in the Department of Justice here in Nebraska.
Thank you, Mr. Bruning. Mrs. Fisher.
When I first ran for the legislature, I promised my constituents that I was going to look for efficiencies in government, streamline government, cut spending, and I rolled up my sleeves and I went to work, and we did it. We did it here in Nebraska. One of the bills I'm most proud of, and I have a lot of support from the Norfolk area on, is LB 84 that we passed last year. That was a bill where I looked outside the box. It was a major policy shift in how we fund our infrastructure here in the state of Nebraska. We're looking past a gas tax. We're looking at now being able to fund new constructions, to look at completing these expressways, to look at meeting the needs all across this state so we have safer roads. And we did it without raising taxes. We did it by deciding that infrastructure is a priority of government. It's a core duty, a core responsibility of government, and we're funding it with an existing quarter-cent of sales tax. So I look outside the box, and I'm proud of that.
Thank you, Mrs. Fisher. Mr. Stenberg.
Well, I would say that it depends to some extent on what the problem is, but I think that as an elected official, what you need to do is consult with your constituents, and in particular, consult with the constituents that have the most knowledge and are most impacted by various things. So, for example, I've met with the Omaha home builders about the new Obama regulations that are making their lives more difficult and houses more expensive. I've met with farmers and talked to them about the farm program and farm exports. I've met with community bankers who have unanimously so far, maybe I'll come across one that doesn't, that thinks Dodd-Frank needs to be repealed as a disaster for our community banks here in Nebraska. If you want to deal with energy policy, you talk to people who understand energy. And I just last week met with an oil man out in Kimball, Nebraska, and he told me about the thousands and thousands of pages of new regulations imposed on him that makes his job harder. So that's what I would do as a United States Senator, meet with my constituents, particularly those most affected by the laws.
Thank you, Mr. Stenberg. Mr. Flynn.
Well, when solving problems, I think history is a great, barometer to go by when it gets right down to it. I mean, we've gone through a lot. And so, but when I have a problem, I go to my constituents, my folk, and we brainstorm and we see what the best solution is actually. But I'm pretty sick and tired of the federal government trying to solve every problem we got going on here when it gets right down to it. The reason I became the man I am is because I didn't have anyone trying to solve the problem for me. I was the issue and the problem, and if I wasn't moving forward, I was the problem. And so what the part that scares me about business right now is the federal. I used to be my biggest obstacle, and now it's the federal government. And we really have to get the federal government out of trying to solve all our problems, get them back to what they are supposed to do, provide a common defense, and look after the general welfare.
Thank you, Mr. Flynn. We're going to try and squeeze in one more question for Rob McCartney, but because of some time limits, we're going to ask the candidates to restrict their answers to 30 seconds each, this one, just to squeeze it in. Rob's question will be directed first to Mrs. Fisher, then Mr. Flynn, Mr. Bruning, and Mr. Stenberg.
30 seconds. I won't ask you to solve all the problems of the world. But draw the line for me again. I like lines being drawn. Draw the line for me again between what is an earmark pork belly in Washington, or what is something simply a good product and a good project for Nebraskans? And could you go on the record one way or the other saying if you're willing for or against earmarks? Define it and then set that standard.
I think we all have a picture of earmarks are when it happens in a non-transparent way. It's a smoke-filled room, it's deals being made. That's not how you make public policy. Here in Nebraska, we have an open system. I spoke about my roads bill earlier. I met with my colleagues. I worked with the governor's office. We had public hearings. People came in and spoke on it. If you have a good proposal, a good project, you should be able to defend it in the public's view with transparency and with accountability.
Thank you, Mrs. Fisher. Mr. Flynn.
I'm not for earmarks at all. And the fact of it is I've seen some communities. I can think of West Point, for example. You know, they build this community center, and they're looking initially at a huge grant from the federal government. And a couple of the people in the community said, you know what, let's build this thing ourselves. And it went from like $12 million to $2 million. And so they didn't have to worry about all the regulations. So my duty is not to bring home the bacon. It's to actually let us operate as a free country and a free state and a free individual.
Thank you, Mr. Flynn. Mr. Bruning.
I will not support earmarks in the United States Senate. It's been a way of doing business there for a long time, and it's wrong, and I will not be supportive of earmarks as United States Senator.
Bruning. Mr. Stenberg.
Right. It's somewhat surprised to hear that, since he asked Senator Ben Nelson to get him an earmark here just a few years ago. But an earmark is a special designation for a local spending project in a congressional bill. I am opposed to earmarks. I'm opposed to earmarks because they're used to buy votes for excessive spending. They're used to buy votes by the leadership in the Congress for bad legislation. My feeling is that with the government run trillion-dollar deficits, local projects, if there were, they need to be financed locally.
Thank you, Mr. Stenberg. We now enter what could be called the rebuttal round of this debate. Each candidate will be given 1 minute to comment on something he or she has heard at tonight's debate, and then also ask a question of a different candidate. The candidate who has asked the question will also have 1 minute to respond. So we start with Mrs. Fisher. Your comments and question, please.
Okay, I have a question for John. Several times you mentioned that you've sued the EPA over 20 times. And as a rancher, I certainly can understand that. I get frustrated with those guys too. However, recently Nebraska Watchdog released an article saying you had received $100,000 in campaign contributions from coal companies over a 2-day period. And a week later, you joined a suit against the EPA that would benefit those companies. I believe this is an appearance that maybe is going to make voters uncomfortable. So yes or no? As a Senate candidate, will you stop taking contributions from industries that can benefit from your position as the chief law enforcement officer in Nebraska?
Well, let me tell you, I've been suing EPA for a long time, and I think they're just dead wrong. For example, the CSAPR regulation, the cross-state air pollution rule. What you've had is EPA costing the city of Grand Island $40 million, the city of Hastings $40 million, the city of Fremont $40 million, and any of you that are NPPD customers, which is basically all of us through our local public power, millions and millions of dollars, all because the Obama administration's goal is to get rid of coal. And it's wrong. Rick Perry didn't say a lot of smart things during his presidential run, but he did say one smart thing. We're the Middle East of coal. We have a lot of it, and it's clean, and it works, and it gives us cheap power. And I'm going to continue to defend coal because I think it's a good, cheap, clean source of power. And I want those market forces to determine what power we're using, not some bureaucrat in Washington, D.C.
Thank you, Mr. Bruning. We continue with Mr. Stenberg. Your comments and question, please.
I think what we need to remember is ultimately we're choosing a person to run against Senator Bob Kerrey in the fall. And I would point out that the polls show that I have a 14 to 18 point lead over Senator Kerrey. Now, Senator Kerrey is going to be a substantial contrast to any of the Republican candidates here. He's opposed to a balanced budget amendment, voted against it. He supports Obamacare. We're all against it. He will work with Harry Reid. In fact, he's made some secret deal, according to the news media, with Harry Reid in Washington. And we need to be sure that we defeat Bob Kerrey if we're going to get the government going in the right direction in Washington. So what I would ask John Bruning, if you lose this Republican primary, John, will you support the Republican primary winner?
Of course.
Mr. Bruning. We continue on with Mr. Flynn. Your comments and question, please.
Well, I hear a lot from Mrs. Fisher how, if anyone tells you this can happen overnight without long discussion and debate, they're kind of they're lying when it gets right down to it. Well, my question is this: as an investment advisor, I don't see how money's going to make it much longer in this country. It's not going to make it. The fact of it is. And that's the difference between legislating and leading. I'm a leader. And when we need something done, we need it done now. That's why I'm saying we need to cut this federal budget by 35%. That's the budget deficit. I'm here to protect America and protect our monetary system. So my question to you, Mrs. Fisher, would be this. How long is our monetary system, how long do we have before it gets crushed at current spending levels the way they are?
Well, Mr. Flynn, we have to get spending under control. I've always said that. I said that when I ran for the legislature 8 years ago. And I do have a record, and it's a public record, of cutting spending. I do have a record, and it's a strong conservative record, of giving tax relief back to our citizens. Government shouldn't be taking our money to do things that I don't believe are necessary if you truly believe in a limited government. So once we get the spending under control, once we can balance our budget at the federal level, then we can start addressing and letting businesses grow jobs and turn this economy around.
Thank you, Mrs. Fisher. Mr. Bruning, your turn for comments and question.
Well, in 10 years as Attorney General, one of the first things I did back when I was elected in 2002 was sworn in 2003, was to create an agriculture and natural resources section. Ag is king in this state. Ag is the driver behind the economy of this state. And I wanted to make sure we had it focused in the Attorney General's office, and I think it's been successful. And not just the Ag unit, but what the Ag unit's done. I've talked about the lawsuits we filed against EPA. A lot of that is pushback against these guys who are trying to regulate everything you can imagine, from farm dust on down. So the Farm Bill is going to be important. We're going to have a new Farm Bill. The new senator is going to have to be a big part of that Farm Bill. I believe we have to have a safety net for farmers in terms of insurance. And I understand, and I think most farmers in this state do too, that direct payments are starting to go away. So, Senator Fisher, I'd ask you, if you're the United States Senator, how do you see that Farm Bill being crafted? What do you think it ought to look like?
Great question. Farming and agriculture is so important to this state, and I'm the only candidate up here who is directly involved in agriculture. I'm a rancher. So I understand the ag economy. We have to consider and make sure that we get a farm bill passed, and we have to make sure that crop insurance is the major priority of that farm bill. Currently, there are 37 programs that are set to expire in this farm bill that we're under by the end of September if this Congress doesn't get up and take some action. And those programs include conservation programs, they include rural development programs. These are important programs all across the state of Nebraska, and we need to make sure that Congress is willing to step up and recognize the importance of agriculture and rural communities in this state.
Thank you, Mrs. Fisher. We've come now to the time of our debate for closing comments by each of our candidates. They've done such a good job of staying within their time limits that we had told them they had 90 seconds each. They might even have a little bit more here in that regard, just a little bit. We'll begin with Mr. Flynn.
As an investment advisor of 29 years, and actually I farmed 350 acres, a couple of years there, I don't see a safe place for money in America anymore. And then I look at the Gatling gun of regulations that's coming at us from all angles. And I realize that, you know what, I won't even have a business in 3 years if this keeps going the way it's going. So actually, last May, I sold my business, burned the boat, and got in this race with both feet. I realized it's either their neck or ours, and it has to be theirs. Now, I'm saying to vote for Pat Flynn, you have to think out of the box, but I will guarantee you this. Who of the four up here can actually put President Obama up against the wall and lead a constitutional revolution? And so the last line of the Declaration of Independence says this. It says, and for the support of this declaration, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. You know, I sold my business. You may think I have a problem, but we all have a true issue here. It's a tough situation we're in. And so what I'm asking you is to become a warrior citizen. That's what we are in America, and we need to get back to that. The last line of the Declaration, and so this is the thing. America will get through this if more of us pray, work, contribute, vote, and get others to do the same. That's what I'm asking you to do on our campaign to help. We have our table out front. We need workers. We want you to tell your family, friends, neighbors, and other people about us. We can do this. America will be victorious. I'm Pat Flynn. I appreciate your support, and God bless America.
Thank you, Mr. Flynn. It is now the turn for Mrs. Fisher to give her closing remarks.
Well, thank you, and thank you all once again for taking an interest in this very, very important election for our country and our state. I'm not your usual politician. Obviously, I'm not one of the good old boys. I'm a wife of 40 years. My husband and I have 3 grown sons who have come back to the family ranch. I am a business person, and I'm also a citizen legislator. And I've been effective in that arena. More importantly, as I travel my legislative district the last 8 years, putting on over 25,000 miles a year, and now putting on over 40 so far in this Senate campaign while doing my job as a state senator, I've listened to people and I've heard their frustrations, their anger, and their concern, and I share those concerns. We need to change Washington. We need to change the way Washington does business. We need to get spending under control. We need to balance the budget. We need to take care of that over $15 trillion in debt. And we can do it. Times are changing. And I'm hoping we get back to those Nebraska values that we all share. We can do this. But we need to change the type of person that we send to Washington. We need to send someone who's taken on those tough issues, who's made a commitment to their constituents to do their job. We need to send somebody to Washington who has those strong values and solid character, because I believe America's brighter days are in front of us. And I'd like you to please send me to Washington, and I promise you that I will roll up my sleeves and fight for you in Washington just like I have here in Nebraska. Because the times are ripe for a change, and the stakes are high. So I ask for your support, and I ask for your vote. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Fisher. We now turn to Mr. Bruning for his closing remarks.
Thanks, Kent. Well, again, thanks to the host for putting this together, and thanks to all of you for being here tonight. It's fun to be here in Madison County. I was looking at Jeannie and Bob Smith and thinking about the first time I was in Madison County was probably at your house in your backyard in the late 80s with my good friend Tobin, your son. It's nice to be back here under these circumstances. And I think today, I hope you understand I've discussed my commitment to conservative principles and how I've proven that commitment through action. My record speaks for itself. When I was in the legislature, I sponsored bills to provide tax relief 17 times, 6 years. As your Attorney General, I've spent the last 2 years working to overturn Obamacare, and we're not done yet. This cycle, I've earned an A rating, and every cycle from the NRA, so you know where I stand on the Second Amendment. And Nebraska Right to Life has endorsed me, as they always have, as I hope they always continue to do, because I'm pro-life to my core. For almost 4 years, we've been living under a government that regulates too much and spends too much and listens too little. We have a sluggish economy. We have $4 a gallon gas. We have a $15 trillion national debt and $1 trillion annual deficits, 4 in a row from this president. And these policies aren't working for our nation, and they won't work in the future. As your Attorney General, I've worked to end the federal government's grab at power. I led the charge against Obamacare all the way to the Supreme Court. I challenged the EPA more than 20 times in court, and I'm fighting the Obama administration's latest attack on our religious liberties. You deserve a senator who's going to fight the federal government all the way. I've done it as Attorney General. I'll do it in the Senate, but I can't do it alone. I'm here to ask for your vote. Joint State Senator Mike Flood, Sheriff York, County Attorney Smith, and I'd very much appreciate your support. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Bruning. Finally, closing comments from Mr. Stenberg.
Well, thank you very much, everyone watching this debate, whether here or on television. As I said at the beginning, I'm running for the United States Senate because I believe we need to change the direction in Washington. And to do that, we need to make several changes. We need to repeal Obamacare. We need to balance the federal budget, and I support a balanced budget amendment to the Constitution of the United States. To do that, as your state treasurer, I cut my budget by 13%. As your Attorney General, I operated that office on the third smallest budget in the United States. We need to roll back the heavy burden of federal regulations, and I've made 2 proposals to do that. 1, repeal every major rule and regulation adopted by the Obama administration and make the bureaucrats go back and start over. And number 2, I support legislation that would require that before any new major federal rule or regulation went into effect, that it be submitted to, voted on, and approved by the Congress of the United States. And if we do that, we'll have a lot less federal regulations and a much better economy. We need to develop our domestic energy resources. That means no more drilling moratoriums. It means developing and allowing the development of oil and gas development on federal lands. We need to secure our borders, and we need term limits. And I have promised that if I am elected as your United States Senator, I will voluntarily limit my service to 2 terms in the United States Senate. Our next senator needs to be a senator who will offer bold solutions to our nation's problems. He needs to be a true conservative. He needs to be a senator who is committed to fundamental values, who doesn't waffle or flip-flop on important issues. If I'm sent to the United States Senate, I will go for the purpose of changing government, not fitting right in. I would ask for your vote for Don Stenberg for the United States Senate. And thank you very much, and God bless America.
Thank you, Mr. Stenberg. Let's give all 4 of our candidates a round of applause. On behalf of the Daily News, Norfolk High School, KETV, and WJAG, let me just point out that we have about 4 weeks until the primary election in May. And it's encouraging to know that the ballots you cast in the Republican Senate primary will be informed ones, thanks in part to your attendance here tonight. So thank you for attending, and good night.